On my channel, I talk a lot about abolitionism and how it can ultimately free the world if we understand that we have to abolish that which does not belong, that which destroys our inherent freedoms as a human species, as a human nature that is born to be free, because we're all equal by nature. As it says in my shirt here, free by nature, slaves by government. And in case you don't understand what that means, you can check out my book, Slavery Gone for Good, Modern Abolitionism, or check out some of the videos on my channel to learn more about that. But in this video, we're going to talk about how to share abolitionism, how to share it with others. And you ask yourself, well, okay, if this is better as a term than, let's say, anarchism, as I talked about in my other videos, it's better than, talking about constitutionalism and other ism words because we're focusing on what needs to be done. It's not just a philosophy, it's also focusing on action. It's looking at slavery, which is the root to what we're talking about when we want freedom. Okay, we get the philosophical basis. We understand why it's important and how it could spark a surprise in people and therefore get them thinking and on to new ideas, such as the ideas that we have about freedom. Is because you might have a lot of ideas about it, and maybe you don't have a website, maybe you don't have a blog, maybe you don't have your own podcast, maybe you are starting it. That's great, and you should have your own materials. But there are things that can help in your efforts to share abolitionism as an abolitionist yourself if you are somebody who wants to free people from slavery. So I'm going to go over 4 things in particular, okay? And there is a level of input involved on your behalf to this, so that way you can make your appeal even better to people who are new to this knowledge. Number 1 is the book. So I have that book called Slavery Gone for Good, Modern Abolitionism. I created it with the intention, the very intention, that it would be shared and taught to others. Okay, that's why it's a very small book. A lot of my works are pretty darn big. This one is very particular. So when it comes to sharing it with other people, this is the thing that I would recommend. If you share this book with others, don't tell them anything about government or anything about particular subjects within the book necessarily, okay? You can use maybe the intro quotes and just show them the back cover or something, right? Because it sparks some interest. But don't talk too much about it because I want them to look into it for themselves. You should want them to do this adventure within themselves of understanding the knowledge, You don't want to be there backpedaling all the time, giving them marching orders. You want them to think through it for themselves. Is this logical? Is this not? Does this make sense? Does it not? Right? Because you're not here to convince anybody, and if you are, then you're already on the wrong path. Because you're not here to convince people, you're here to share a worldview that they already have, which is, hopefully, that people are equal, that people deserve to be free. And then understanding the means to achieve that, well, that's a whole nother scenario. But even then, people still know what to do, and they just need a little bit of push, and that's where you'll come in at the end. Once they read it, maybe once they have some extra questions that you can fill in some extra gaps and say, hey, this is my perspective on it. I think, this is what I have to add to that myself as an abolitionist. That's great, but when you're introducing the book, people don't know that government is slavery, right? So just say the book is simply about slavery, because that is a good way to intro them into the book, because it might scare them off if you automatically say, like the thing that's on my shirt, free by nature, slaves by government, because that last part they disagree with, but yet the first part they agree with. And it's like, well, why is that? Because they're indoctrinated into a mental slavery called statism, which is described within the book. And since that is a mental condition which has to be deconstructed, as it was in the 1800s, it takes a lot of time and effort and a lot of denial, a lot of cognitive dissonance to get through to that point. And so it takes time for an individual to look through the material themselves and reflect upon it, and then you could come in as sort of a support and say, hey, yeah, I do support this knowledge, I agree with it, and here is my thoughts on it, I can add on to this. But if you allow them, give them the space to really think about it for themselves, it helps a lot. Instead of talking about like, oh, well, this is about government and why government is slavery, they're going to be like, I don't know how I feel about this. They're going to be thinking about it the whole time while they're reading it. It's going to be a little off compared to what it could be. Now, maybe they came across you wearing this shirt, so maybe they know as to more what to expect, but hopefully they're open-minded to read the book. Of course, considering if they're a friend of yours, hopefully that would be the case, right? And if they're not open-minded, of course, you can do other methods like the ones I'm mentioning here, as long, the 3 other aspects that I'm mentioning. So number two is the newspaper. So we have an abolitionist newspaper called the Liberator 2, and so long as this newspaper keeps going, it is fully open to the public. Anybody can contribute, including them. If they care about freedom, maybe they don't agree with all the things yet, all the topics, but they can still contribute. They can look through the newspaper, see many different perspectives on slavery, and that could really help to shape the minds of individuals. That's why the newspaper was created, for education. It's not there for news and clickbait and, oh, here's today's news and what's happening next week. It's only, temporal. No, we're looking at something that's timeless. So it's open to the public. There's a weekly edition every week, and it's bringing the revival of the abolitionists of the past. We cannot deny that they essentially helped make America. So that brings me to my next point, is that let's say you're talking to somebody who's used to politics, which could be likely, since if they're concerned about freedom, they might go to politics, even though it's probably the worst place to go to first. So politics, you have left versus right, what's going on. Did they know, you can ask this individual, did they know that the abolitionists did not partake in elections, did not always, vote for people and participate in any public office at all because they saw it was connected to violence and therefore connected to slavery and connected to human authority? Just ask questions like that. And it's like, oh, I didn't know that. And you say, oh, well, this book basically talks more about it, or this newspaper talks more about it, or let me share with you why that's the case and why they did that. Because then if you explore any one of those reasons, you basically are sharing abolitionism with them, right? So you can use that as a bridge, in particular for people who are into politics, and say that the abolitionists of the past basically helped with our nation a lot, whether it be economically, spiritually, mentally, physically, whatever have you, because they were freeing people from slavery. I mean, that's a big task. 6,000 years later, and then people free themselves from slavery, and then they have to spread that across the world as well, and they have to set up newspapers in every town. They have to be attacked by the media and censored. Even if they can just agree and say, yeah, censorship is wrong, you can use that as a basis and say, yeah, well, guess what? The abolitionists of the 1800s were censored for trying to free people from slavery. Right? And there were mainstream press institutions that were not allowing the Liberator newspaper to get any circulation because it was free and independent. So what you have also is another tip. This is my final tip here, which is, let's say you're talking to somebody who's religious, and you say, well, that's kind of similar to politics. Well, religion, it could actually be a pretty helpful bridge. A lot of the abolitionists of the past use religious grounds for their basis, as to say, well, humans are under the government of God. They're not under the government of man, so that's why they deserve to be free, all peoples. That was their basis. And then you saw deism as well, which is another optional intro. You can share with them my deism intro, my deism video, if you think that's going to help them with their worldview, or maybe they're like on the fence, they're a Christian, or they don't like what the Catholic Church is doing, for example. These are just examples. And if they're just at all any spiritual, religious, these people, they were deists, they were Christians, they were Catholics, you had all sorts of types, but they all believed that essentially the government of God was above that of man. And, I have books talking about that here: Radical Abolitionism, Anarchy in the Government of God, and Anti-Slavery Thought. That's another book that sort of goes into that topic, and I use some quotes from that book as well for my book, so you can say, hey, yeah, this book goes more into it. This newspaper has all sorts of different individuals who are spiritual and not spiritual, who, basically all believe the same thing, that, humans are meant to be free. Whether God said so or not, we're basically meant to, because by our nature, we are all the same. Or at least what gives somebody some special ability over others. And this is the same exact arguments that the abolitionists of the past made. So you can say that too. You can say, well, the same exact arguments made against the abolition of government is the same used against the abolition of slavery, because, well, maybe they're one and the same. Maybe, you got to look into this. Why is that so similar? Just ask the questions, allow them to think about it a little bit, and then with these materials, it can really help them even further. So I hope that shared with some tips on how to share abolitionism. Of course, I have tons of materials that I always share. You could always go to nita.one/share. There's always materials on there. If you scroll down, there might be business cards where you can share more about abolitionism easier. You can see the flag, right, like the one that's right over there with the black stripes that says no union with slavery. Well, that makes sense. Well, because you want to unite humanity, you want to unite the world, and you realize that by having people that get to be masters and other people slaves, that's not equality. And if people are talking about equality nowadays, whether it be racially, sexually, what have you, well, let's look at this equality. Is this equality gone? Is this done away with? Is there other forms of equality we have to look at? That's another bridge you can use. You have to look at the individual you're talking to. I ultimately can't tell you what you should or should not say. You have to look at the individual, feel them out for heart. You shouldn't go in there with a script and knowing what to say, but you should generally just allow the space for them to talk, for them to question these ideas. So if anything, ask questions and keep it really, really simple. You go in with a rant and you start talking about government and all these other ideas, you may stray away from the idea of slavery, which is the focus of abolitionism. So if it's the focus, let's make it the focus. Thank you very much. This is Corey Edmund Engelot. Nature is the answer.